As the United States' 16th president took office for a second term, the country was 3 years into an embittered, bloody battle. With the war drawing to a close, what America needed from its leader was someone who could not only restore the country, but repair the honor that had been blighted by bloodshed. Abraham Lincoln set a standard with his presidency that few men who held the office matched until the first decades of the 20th century. In a one-room log cabin in Hardin County, Kentucky, Abraham Lincoln was born to Thomas and Nancy Lincoln on February 12, 1809. The man who would become America's 16th president was self-educated and grew to become a practicing country lawyer. Relocating to Illinois in 1832, Lincoln saw himself embroiled in politics in his first campaign for the Illinois General Assembly in a failed bid for a seat in the legislative body. A great orator, Lincoln could draw and rouse a crowd, but his lack of education and political connections may have been what kept him out of the governing body early in his career. 14 years later, however, Lincoln saw himself elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. Promising to only serve one term, Lincoln then returned to the prairie, practicing law in Springfield, Illinois. Lincoln's return to politics came in a series of speeches. The most notable was the Peoria speech of October 16, 1854, which was a response to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which allowed settlers in Kansas and Nebraska to decide whether their region would allow slavery. The speeches spoke out against senior Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas, who was responsible for the popular sovereignty aspect of the act. In 1860, Lincoln secured the Republican nomination and subsequently won the presidential election against his political rival Stephen Douglas. Lincoln entering office was seen by Southern secessionists as the final line in the sand and announced that they would leave the Union before Lincoln took office the following March. Indeed, soon after, the Confederate States of America was formed, and the country was at war. As the battles raged on, Lincoln saw the importance of removing the main point of contention, slavery, as a measure for reuniting the nation. His Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 utilized the Union Army in protecting escaped slaves, and the passage of the 13th Amendment saw federal law enacted banning slavery outright. While adept at political maneuvers, Lincoln proved an able leader of the Union Army as well. He delegated Ulysses S. Grant as commanding general of the Union Army and oversaw a successful naval blockade of Southern trade and supply routes. Lincoln's famous Gettysburg Address, delivered 4.5 months after the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863, saw Union soldiers defeat advancing Confederates, stressed the importance of not only the reunification of the country, but the unification of all men as equals, as stressed by the Constitution, written and adopted just over a century prior.
77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note, nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
The Civil War effectively ended April 9, 1865, when Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant. The Herculean task of Reconstruction now lay before the nation, but many were still incensed that not only had the Confederates lost and the slaves been freed, but now Lincoln began to advocate voting rights for free blacks. These factors seemed unacceptable to men like John Wilkes Booth. A popular actor who had served as a spy for the Confederates during the war, Booth initially planned to kidnap the president in exchange for the freedom of Confederate POWs. After the surrender, and attending a speech where Lincoln promoted voting rights for freed slaves, Booth was convinced that he had to kill the president. On April 14th, 1865, Lincoln attended a production of Our American Cousin, a play, at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. At 10:13 that night, Booth ended Lincoln's term in office.